Meiosis. Now remember the key concepts that weren't answered by the first vodcast on part 1. Now we need to look at these. What is the order of the phases of meiosis and what happens during each phase? That's going to be the majority of your quiz. So it's knowing what happens in the phases of meiosis and in what order. And if you learn mitosis real well, a lot of it's going to be very similar. And why is meiosis important? All right, meiosis is the process whereby one diploid cell forms haploid cells. Those haploid cells are the reproductive cells, the gametes, the sperm, the ova. Another way of looking at it, it is a dividing process during which the number of chromosomes is cut by half in each resulting cell. So we all began as a zygote. And in that zygote, if this is a human being that we're talking about, there were 23 chromosomes that came from mom, and that was in the ovum, and 23 chromosomes that came from dad, which was in the sperm. And then fertilization took place and created a zygote that had 46 chromosomes. That's a diploid cell. So we all began life as a diploid cell. Those 23 from mom and the 23 from dad made 23 pairs of chromosomes. And it made 23 homologous pairs of chromosomes. And rapidly then we started dividing. That cell divided into 2, into 4, and so forth, as I've been telling you. But the key is eventually they differentiated and created all the different types of body cells or somatic cells that we have. And all of them got a copy of the DNA from the original zygote. And that's just copied over and over again through the mitosis and cytokinesis. But eventually, if we want the human race to continue, we had to be able to reproduce. So we needed to reproduce offspring that also had in each of their nuclei 46 chromosomes. So that sperm that we started with and the ovum that we started with could not have 46 chromosomes in each. Otherwise, we'd get a cell that has 92 chromosomes. So the sperm had to have a reduction in the number of chromosomes by half. It had to have one set. And the ovum, the same thing. It had to have a reduction in the chromosomes by half. So instead of 46, 23. 1 out of each of the homologous pairs. And the sperm, 1 out of each of the homologous pairs. So this process then is needed in order for sexual reproduction to occur. And that process is called meiosis. That's the process where a body cell makes these gametes. Now, where are these body cells that are making the gametes? Well, remember, the gametes are the reproductive cells. Sperm, ovum, or ova plural. So they're made by reproductive organs. So the male reproductive organ is the testis, and the female reproductive organ is the ovary. And so it is in these organs that meiosis takes place. And that's the only place that is going on, is in the reproductive organs. And it makes the reproductive cells. So let's see how that process takes place. Here's a diagram showing you meiosis. And the key difference between mitosis and meiosis is mitosis has one cell division. And that took place in telophase. And it created 2 daughter cells that had 46 chromosomes that had exact copies. They were identical. In meiosis, you have a first division, which you can see there, and it divides and makes 2 cells. And then it has a second division, which each of those cells divide and then produce 2 cells, which gives us a total of 4 haploid cells. And those would be, if this is in the testis, which is called spermatogenesis, that would be 4 sperm. If it is in the female ovary, then it produces 4 haploid cells, which is the process is called oogenesis, and only one of those is actually the chosen ovum. The other 3 are called like polar bodies, and they will disintegrate, and they are not used. In meiosis, one diploid cell, that's in the reproductive organ, divides and makes 4 haploid cells, sex cells, reproductive cells, sperm, ova. Meiosis occurs only during the formation of sex cells, so it is only in the reproductive organs that we see meiosis going on. It does not happen in any of our other organs. Meiosis involves 2 divisions of the nucleus, and that's why we have it called Meiosis I and Meiosis II, referring to the 2 divisions. A reproductive cell goes through interphase before beginning meiosis I. So a reproductive cell goes and starts its life cycle, the interphase, and that's where its normal growth and so forth is going on. Here's the key thing to look at. Now this is in meiosis I, and there are 4 phases, just like in mitosis, and they go in the exact same order: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And they call them prophase 1, prophase 2, prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1. And in prophase 1, you have the nuclear membrane disappearing, the nucleolus going away, you have the chromosomes condensing, forming those homologous pairs of sister chromatids, and that happened just as it did in mitosis. Then metaphase, remember, that's where they line up on the division plate, or the equatorial plane in the middle. So the homologous chromosomes line up at the center of the cell, and the spindle fibers attached to each of them. Remember, the spindle fibers were formed in prophase. And then anaphase is as soon as they separate. The homologous chromosomes separate and are pulled to opposite poles. And as soon as they reach the end of the pole, remember, that's the beginning of telophase. And telophase, what disappeared has to reappear, what appeared has to disappear. So you got the nuclear membrane forming around each new nucleus. You've got the cytoplasm then that has to divide last. And that makes 2 daughter cells. But meiosis is not complete yet. It actually goes through a second division, which is referred to as Meiosis II. And so it goes through prophase 2, the nuclear membrane breaks down again, nucleolus disappears. Metaphase, they line up, those sister chromatids line up in the center of the cell. Anaphase, the sister chromatids of each chromosome begin to separate and they're pulled to opposite ends. As soon as they reach the opposite pole, then they are in telophase. And telophase is where the nuclear membrane starts to form around each new nucleus. And this is now, remembering, happening in 2 cells, so you're going to end up with 4. And it's going to reduce the number of chromosomes by half. So in a human, it would start off with 46 and end up with 23 in each of those 4 cells. Okay, here's an animation or a little video clip.
Cell division that produces half the number of chromosomes as a body cell is meiosis. Interphase. During interphase that comes before meiosis I, the cell's chromosomes actively duplicate themselves. Each chromosome then consists of 2 strands held together by a centromere. Prophase I. In prophase I, double-stranded chromosomes and spindle fibers appear. The nuclear membrane and the nucleolus disappear. Like chromosomes come together in matching pairs. Metaphase I. In metaphase I, the pairs of chromosomes line up in the center of the cell. Their centromeres become attached to spindle fibers. Anaphase I. In anaphase I, each double-stranded chromosome separates from its matching chromosome. Each one is pulled to opposite ends of the cell. This critical step ensures that each new cell will receive only 1 chromosome from each chromosome pair. Telophase I. In telophase 1, the cytoplasm divides and two cells form, each with half the number of chromosomes. Each chromosome is still double-stranded. The second division in meiosis consists of prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, and telophase 2. Prophase 2. In prophase 2, the double-stranded chromosomes and spindle fibers reappear in each new cell. Metaphase 2. In metaphase 2, the double-stranded chromosomes move to the center of the cell. There, the centromeres attach to spindle fibers. Anaphase 2. During anaphase 2, the centromere divides, and the two strands of each chromosome separate and move to opposite ends of the cell. Telophase 2. As telophase 2 begins, the spindle fibers disappear, and a nuclear membrane forms around the chromosomes at each end of the cell. Each nucleus contains only half the number of chromosomes at each end of the cell, and contains only half the number of chromosomes that were in the original cell. 4 cells are produced.
Now, why is this process important? Meiosis forms the reproductive cells, the sex cells, with the correct haploid number of chromosomes. In a mutation, most cells, if it has one extra chromosome or not missing a whole chromosome, that produces death, usually. And so, therefore, the life of the organism would not go on if their reproductive cells did not have the correct number of chromosomes in it. And for a human, that would be 23. Meiosis also creates genetic variation by producing these haploid cells, because you get a genetic variety, because you think of the 46 chromosomes to begin with, you're ending up with just 23. And some of those could be from your mom, some of them from your dad, and the ones that made you. But also what was not talked about in this, and you'll learn more in biology, has to do with in that process of when they are forming these homologous chromosomes and they condense and they get real tight and they coil up, they actually cross over and switch some genes. And so that's another mixing of the gene pool, which is giving us genetic variation. So when haploid sex cells join together during fertilization, they make the diploid zygote, or the fertilized, the book calls it an egg, I call it ovum, technical word, fertilized ovum. So that's the process of meiosis. It's important for fertilization. It's important for producing a zygote that has the right amount of chromosomes. A fertilized ovum forms when sex cells, reproductive cells, egg, ovum, Swiss sperm, join together, and they divide by mitosis to create the diploid organism. All these organisms that reproduce sexually began as a zygote that undergoes mitosis and mitosis and mitosis to form that organism. So you can look at the chromosome. The two parents, the male and the female, in meiosis produce an ovum with half the number, 40, and a sperm with half the number, so that the zygote has the right amount and develops into the little baby duck. How do mitosis and meiosis differ? During mitosis and cell division, a body cell, a somatic cell, and its nucleus divide once and produce two identical cells called daughter cells. So one division, that's what you need to remember. Mitosis, one division. The two daughter cells produced by mitosis have the exact same genetic information. It replicated, remember, and that was in interphase during the S stage. During meiosis, the reproductive cell in its nucleus divides twice, where you produce 4 cells, 2 pairs of identical haploid cells. Meiosis forms reproductive cells and is used for sexual reproduction. So key differences: mitosis, one division; Meiosis II division. Mitosis occurs in the body cells to produce more body cells, somatic cells to produce somatic cells. Meiosis is where a somatic cell in the reproductive organ produces the sex cells, which are haploid. So a diploid is producing a haploid. Mitosis, a diploid is producing a diploid. Advantages. Make sure you know these advantages of sexual reproduction. And one thing is the genetic variation that we have. Any organism that produces by sexual reproduction has variety. And you can see all the different varieties of humans. You can see all the different varieties of animals, such as dogs, cats, horses, whatever. And due to genetic variation or variety, individuals within a population have slight differences. So these are some advantages to the sexual reproduction. In the next lesson, we will be talking about asexual reproduction and some of the disadvantages to that. Genetic variation may enable one plant to be more disease resistant than another within the same species. Advantages of sexual reproduction are selective breeding, and it has been used to develop many types of plants and animals with desirable traits. And selective breeding is done and is even mentioned in Scripture. And what it is you would pick, like if you wanted to raise cattle, you would pick the cows or the females, the cows that have the kinds of characteristics like that you want. In other words, if it's for dairy, ones that produce a lot of milk. Or if it's for meat, one that has big bodies. And so you would mate with that intent. Bigger bodies, more milk production, that's what you want. So you pick those types of cows to mate with the bull. A good example is in the plant kingdom. Farmers use this all the time and try to get a genetic cross of a plant that is, let's say, Marquise wheat is a good example. And Marquise wheat, I forget the two kinds of wheat that make it up, but there's one kind of wheat that was good at resisting certain wheat diseases, but it was not very tolerable to climate changes. And then there was another kind of wheat that wasn't very good at resisting disease, but it was great at handling climate changes. So what they decided then is to try to create a type of wheat with these two characteristics by crossing them. And what they developed was Marquise wheat, which is not as susceptible to the diseases of wheat, and it is able to withstand temperature changes. So they were successful. Now, not all their endeavors have been successful. I think it was a Russian scientist that tried to create, let's see, I think it was cabbage and radishes. It was something like that, where they wanted the leaves that were edible off of one plant, and they wanted the roots that were edible off another plant. And so they worked, and it was many years they worked on this, and they finally got a seed, and when it developed, it had the roots from the cabbage and the leaves from the radishes. So it got the exact end result that they didn't want. So all of these are not as successful as we think, but many have been. And these are what are called the hybrids. And you could go buy hybrid roses, and there's hybrid corn. And what that means is it's been crossed with two different types with different values or different kinds of qualities that they have to try to produce one that had both those qualities. And that's selective breeding. So they select what parents to use to breed to get a certain kind of characteristic or trait. There are some disadvantages of sexual reproduction. The organisms have to grow and develop until they're mature enough to produce reproductive cells, sex cells. And that varies for each type of organism. Of course, our age that is around, well, puberty. It will hit you in the mid-teens or early teens. An organism must form sex cells, either sperm or ova, to produce an organism. So it can't on its own produce organisms, which some can. There's some organisms that just by themselves, it only takes one, and they can produce two. And we'll talk about that when we get into the asexual reproduction.